The fluorescent lights inside Courtroom 7 of the E. Barrett Prettyman Federal Courthouse had never felt so heavy. Daniel Holt sat at the defense table with his hands folded in front of him, the way his father had taught him to sit at church when he was a little boy in Charlottesville, Virginia, back when the world still made sense. He was 34 years old. He had thick, calloused hands from 16 years of working on car engines, a face that had aged 10 years in the last 8 months, and eyes that no longer seemed to expect anything good from the morning. His attorney, Paula Simmons, sat beside him arranging papers she had no real reason to arrange. They both knew those papers didn't matter anymore. The jury had spoken 3 days earlier. 12 Americans from the District of Columbia had deliberated for 9 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict. First-degree murder. Warren Ashby, one of the most powerful real estate developers on the eastern seaboard, was dead, and the evidence had told a story that pointed directly at Daniel Holt, a mechanic from a small town outside Richmond who had no criminal record, no motive that made any real sense, and no alibi for the night of October 14th. The gallery was packed. Cameras weren't permitted inside federal courtrooms, but reporters filled every available seat, notebooks open, pens ready. Warren Ashby had been a very public man, and his death had been a very public story, the kind of story that ran at the top of every hour for months. Daniel had watched his own face on the television above the waiting room in the county jail, seen the graphics networks used to describe him, heard the way anchors let their voices drop half a register when they said his name, as if his name itself were evidence of something. Judge Margaret Calloway entered from the side door at precisely 10 in the morning. Everyone stood. She was 61, grey-haired, with reading glasses. She pushed up her nose before she sat down, and she had the practiced composure of someone who had delivered enough sentences in her career that she no longer searched for words. She had them ready. She arranged her papers, looked out at the courtroom, and then looked at Daniel with the kind of sustained, deliberate attention that told him she had thought very carefully about what she was about to say. Assistant U.S. Attorney Thomas Crane sat at the prosecution table without expression. He had won this case the way a surgeon completes a procedure, efficiently, without sentiment. He had spent 8 months building a narrative around surveillance footage, fingerprint analysis, financial records, and the testimony of 3 witnesses who placed Daniel near the Ashby Group Tower on the night of the murder. Every piece had fit together the way pieces fit together when someone wants them to. Paula Simmons leaned slightly toward Daniel and said very quietly, "Whatever happens in the next few minutes, you keep your composure. You hear me?" Daniel nodded. He didn't trust his voice. Judge Calloway cleared her throat and opened the folder in front of her. "Mr. Holt, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on 1 count of murder in the 1st degree in connection with the death of Warren Ashby on the evening of October 14th of last year. Before I impose sentence, I want to acknowledge that this has been a case that has received extraordinary public attention, and I want to be clear that this court's decision rests solely on the evidence presented within these walls and on the law of this country. Do you have anything you wish to say before I proceed?" Paula touched Daniel's arm. He rose. He had rehearsed something. He had written it on the back of a legal pad 3 nights ago and read it so many times the words had stopped meaning anything. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was not what he had written. "I didn't kill Warren Ashby," he said. "I don't know who did. I don't know why someone chose me for this. But I know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life wondering if the truth is ever going to matter to anyone." He sat down. The gallery murmured. Judge Calloway waited for the room to settle, then looked back at her papers. "Mr. Holt, it is the judgment of this court." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Everyone turned. It was the kind of interruption that simply does not happen in federal court. U.S. Marshals are positioned at every entrance precisely to prevent it, but the 2 men who appeared in the doorway were not intruders being subdued. They were marshals themselves, and between them walked a young man in civilian clothes, late 20s or early 30s, slightly underweight, with dark circles beneath his eyes, and the careful, deliberate way of moving that belongs to someone who has spent a long time being invisible. He walked to the center aisle and stopped. Thomas Crane was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, I don't know what—" "Your Honor." The young man's voice was calm but firm, the kind of calm that comes from preparation, not from ease. My name is Kevin Holt. I have been missing for 20 years, and the man you are about to sentence is my brother, and he is innocent." The silence that followed was the kind that seems to have physical weight. Daniel Holt had not moved. He sat completely still at the defense table, staring at the young man in the aisle, and the expression on his face was not recognition. It was something closer to a man watching his own mind break open, unable to decide whether what he was seeing was real or a symptom of everything the last year had cost him. Paula Simmons grabbed his arm. Daniel, look at me." He couldn't. 20 years ago, Kevin Holt had been 10 years old. They had been camping near the Shenandoah River in Page County, Virginia. It was a late August weekend, the kind their father organized every summer. 3 days in the woods with sleeping bags and a cast-iron skillet and ghost stories that kept the boys awake until midnight. Daniel had been 14. He had been the one watching Kevin when Kevin wandered off to look at a creek he'd spotted through the trees. Daniel had been reading. He had not noticed his brother was gone until his father called them both in for dinner, and only one of them came. They searched for 3 days. Then the FBI arrived. Then the helicopters. The story ran nationally for 2 weeks. A 10-year-old boy vanished in the Virginia wilderness without a single witness, without a footprint, without a dropped shoe or a torn piece of clothing. The case agent, a veteran investigator named Brenda Cole, told the family after 8 months of active investigation that she had never encountered a disappearance so completely without trace. Kevin Holt was declared legally dead 7 years later, when Daniel was 21, and both of his parents had already been buried. Daniel had carried the weight of that afternoon for every day of his adult life. And now a man was standing in a federal courtroom saying he was Kevin Holt. Judge Calloway raised her hand and the room settled. She looked at the U.S. Marshals flanking the young man. "Agent Mercer," she said, directing her attention toward the FBI agent seated behind the prosecution table. "Can someone explain to this court what is happening?" Special Agent Diane Mercer stood. She was 43, compact, with short brown hair and the expression of someone who has just been handed a situation she has been quietly preparing for. "Your Honor, the FBI's Washington field office was contacted 36 hours ago by this individual and 2 corroborating federal agents from a task force operating out of Charlotte, North Carolina. He provided documentation, biological samples, and encrypted files that are currently under analysis. His DNA has been preliminarily cross-referenced against the original missing person file. We believe his identity claim is credible and warrants immediate verification." Thomas Crane stepped forward. "Your Honor, this court has reached a verdict. Whatever this individual is claiming, Mr. Crane," the judge said quietly, and that was enough to stop him. She looked at the young man again. "You understand that claiming a false identity in a federal proceeding carries severe criminal consequences?" "Yes, ma'am," Kevin said, "and you are making this claim voluntarily, under the protection of federal officers, with full knowledge of those consequences?" "Yes, ma'am, I've waited 20 years for this morning. I'm not going anywhere." Judge Calloway removed her reading glasses and set them on the folder in front of her. "I am suspending the sentencing in this matter, pending independent verification of the identity of this individual and review of any evidence he has provided to federal authorities. Mr. Holt," she said, and both brothers looked up at the same time. She directed her gaze at the defense table. "You will remain in the custody of the U.S. Marshals Service. This proceeding is recessed. Court is adjourned." She struck her gavel and walked out, and the courtroom immediately became something loud and chaotic and barely contained. Daniel Holt had still not moved. Kevin walked down the center aisle toward the defense table. A marshal put a hand on his shoulder to slow him, then looked at Agent Mercer, who gave the smallest nod, and the marshal stepped back. Kevin stopped at the low wooden gate separating the gallery from the court and looked at his brother across the distance. Daniel finally stood. He walked to the gate and stood on the other side of it, and neither of them said anything for a moment that seemed to contain everything the last 20 years had cost both of them. Then Daniel said, "You have a scar on your left knee from falling off Dad's riding mower." Kevin lifted the leg of his jeans just enough. The scar was there, pale, crescent-shaped, exactly where it had always been. Daniel pressed both hands flat against the top of the gate and dropped his chin to his chest, and did not make a sound. but the way his shoulders moved told everyone in the room still watching that the sound was happening somewhere deeper than sound usually goes. The DNA results came back fully confirmed 47 hours later. Kevin Holt was alive. The story broke across every major news outlet simultaneously, and with the force of something that rewrites the assumptions people carry about what is and isn't possible. A missing child, declared dead nearly 2 decades earlier, walks into a federal courthouse and stops a murder sentencing. The cable networks cleared their afternoon programming. Editorial boards called it one of the most extraordinary events in recent American legal history. Social media generated 8 million posts about Kevin Holt in the first 12 hours alone. But Kevin wasn't speaking to the media. He was sitting in a secured room inside the FBI's field office on 4th Street with Agent Mercer and a rotating team of investigators. And what he was saying was far more complicated than anything the networks were speculating about. He had not wandered off by accident. There was no animal, no fall, no disorientation in the forest. 2 men had been watching the campsite. They'd been patient. They waited until they saw the 14-year-old put his book over his face and the father disappear into the tree line to gather firewood. And then they moved quickly and without sound, and Kevin Holt had been inside a white panel van within 4 minutes of leaving his brother's line of sight. By the time Daniel raised the alarm, the van was already on Route 340, heading towards Charlottesville, and Kevin was unconscious in the back. He remembered very little of the first days. He remembered a room with no windows. He remembered a woman he was told to call Carol, who fed him cereal and told him in a very flat, measured voice that he was not going to be harmed if he cooperated. He remembered that cooperation, in that room, meant being still and being quiet and not asking about his family. By the time he was 11, he was living in a house in Raleigh, North Carolina, under the name Andrew Marsh, enrolled in a public elementary school, registered as the ward of a man named Frank Sutter, who worked in commercial real estate. He knew Frank Sutter was not his real guardian. He knew that Andrew Marsh was not his real name. He had a memory of Shenandoah that he kept extremely private and visited only in the quietest part of the night when no one could see his face. He understood, with the particular intelligence of a child who has been forced to survive, that expressing that memory openly would cost him something he could not afford to lose. What he was, though nobody ever said it plainly to him, was a protected asset. The organization that had taken him was not a trafficking ring in the way most people understand the term. It did not sell children. It used them. It used them as legal identities, as financial instruments, as the undetectable human layer inside shell companies and wire transfers and trust arrangements that required a living person's social security number and a face that could appear convincingly at a notary's office or a bank branch or a court proceeding. Children taken young enough could be rebuilt entirely. By the time they were adults, they were inside the system in ways that no forensic accountant would ever think to examine. The man at the center of it was Warren Ashby. Kevin had spent 11 years working his way into Ashby's trust. He had started at 20 when Frank Sutter introduced him to a junior position in the financial management division of Ashby Group's holding company as Andrew Marsh, financial analyst. He was careful, he was patient. He learned the internal architecture of the organization the way a locksmith studies a mechanism, understanding each tumbler before touching any of them. He began copying files in his 3rd year. He stored them on encrypted drives he kept in 3 different locations. He documented everything he witnessed and dated every document in a manner that would be verifiable to any federal investigator who knew what they were looking at. By the time Warren Ashby was murdered, Kevin Holt had assembled one of the most comprehensive internal fraud dossiers in corporate criminal history. He had not known about Daniel's arrest when it happened. He had been in the Cayman Islands in October, managing a documentation transfer for Ashby Group under his cover identity, and the news of Ashby's death had reached him through internal channels first, framed as a tragedy, a shock, a loss to the company. He had not seen American news for 3 weeks. It was a contact in the Charlotte task force, a federal agent named Willis Graham, who had been building a parallel case against Ashby for 4 years, who finally reached Kevin through a secure channel and told him that his brother had been arrested for the murder. Kevin had read the message 3 times. Then he had put the phone face down on the table and sat very still for a long time. He had always known that when he finally came forward, He would lose Andrew Marsh forever. He would lose the safety of invisibility, the protection of the cover he had maintained for over a decade. He would have to explain 20 years of absence to a brother who had spent 20 years believing he had failed to protect him. He had told himself for years that the moment would come when it was right, when the evidence was complete, when the case was strong enough that coming forward wouldn't simply get him killed before he could testify. He had not expected the moment to arrive with his brother's face on a courtroom television 3 days from a life sentence. He booked a flight from Nassau to Washington the same night. Agent Mercer listened to all of this across 2 long days of recorded interviews, and she was not someone who was easily shaken. She had 17 years in federal law enforcement. She had worked organized crime, public corruption, interstate fraud. But she found herself pausing the recorder at certain moments and just listening to Kevin Holt describe his life with the same steady, unadorned precision that she recognized as the language of someone who has had to narrate their own reality without flinching for a very long time, because flinching was never an option. What she was holding, she understood increasingly, was not just the story of a missing child. It was the key to a criminal enterprise that had been operating inside American financial infrastructure for nearly 3 decades. Warren Ashby had built his real estate empire on a foundation that was real and legitimate in its early years. He was talented, he was aggressive, he understood markets and leverage and how to read a city's appetite for development before anyone else did. By the mid-90s, he was worth $200 million through entirely legal means. But the scale he wanted, the kind of wealth and influence that insulates a man from every conceivable consequence, required infrastructure that legitimate business couldn't provide fast enough. He found it through a partnership with a man named Gerard Solis, a former federal contractor from Northern Virginia, who had spent 15 years building relationships with people who moved money across international jurisdictions and needed American corporate structures to clean it. What Ashby provided was the real estate. What Solis provided was the pipeline. And what the abducted children provided was the untraceable legal identity layer that kept every transaction 1 degree removed from any name that could be directly investigated. There had been, Kevin told Mercer, at least 14 children over the span of 22 years. He knew because he had found the records. He had found names and dates and photographs of other children who had been restructured the way he had been restructured, placed inside positions within Ashby's corporate network, given new identities and new histories. Some of them were still inside, some had died. One had tried to run in 2009 and had been found 6 weeks later at the bottom of a ravine outside Ashford, West Virginia. Ruled an accident. Case closed. Mercer put a federal protection detail on Kevin and immediately contacted the Department of Justice. The question of Daniel Holt's frame became cleaner the more they examined it. He had done routine mechanical work on a fleet vehicle belonging to one of Ashby's shell companies in September of the previous year. The vehicle had been brought into his shop outside Richmond with engine trouble, paid in cash, and retrieved 2 days later. What Daniel hadn't known was that the vehicle contained a hidden compartment behind the rear seat panel, and inside that compartment was a portable hard drive with files that were not supposed to exist outside of Ashby's secured network. Someone had been moving them. Someone inside the organization had been planning to use them as leverage. Ashby's people had discovered the drive was missing before the vehicle was retrieved from Daniel's shop. They had searched the car 3 times. They had searched Daniel's shop. They found nothing because Daniel didn't have it. He had never known about any compartment, but Ashby's team didn't know that, and in the weeks that followed, someone made the calculation that it was simpler and cleaner to eliminate Daniel entirely than to take any further risk of those files resurfacing. Warren Ashby was killed by one of his own people before the frame against Daniel was even complete. Mercer was 90% certain that the murder had been ordered by Gerard Solis, who had spent 30 years being the invisible partner and had apparently decided that Ashby's increasingly erratic behavior in the last months of his life posed an unacceptable exposure risk. The murder weapon, the financial records suggesting a dispute, the surveillance footage positioning Daniel near the Ashby Group tower, all of it had been staged by Solis's operational team in less than 72 hours. It was, Mercer acknowledged to her supervisor, extremely professional work. The missing hard drive, it turned out, had fallen behind the wall panel during the repair work and been discovered by one of Daniel's employees 2 months after his arrest, who had no idea what it was and had left it on a shelf in the back of the shop where it sat until federal agents executed a search warrant on the property as part of the reinvestigation and found it in 11 minutes. Thomas Crane resigned from the case within 4 days of Kevin's appearance in the courtroom. He did not resign from the Department of Justice, and he maintained publicly that he had prosecuted in good faith based on the evidence available to him. Nobody could prove otherwise. But internal reviews would later suggest that at least 2 of the witnesses who had testified about seeing Daniel near the Ashby building had been approached and prepared by individuals with connections to Solis's legal team, and that someone had ensured the original investigation's tunnel vision around Daniel was never seriously challenged by steering several potentially exculpatory leads into dead files. Daniel was released from custody on a Friday afternoon in November. Paula Simmons met him at the exit with a cup of coffee and a signed order from Judge Calloway formally vacating the verdict pending full exoneration proceedings. He stood outside the federal detention facility in the afternoon light and drank the coffee slowly and said very little. Kevin was waiting for him in a car down the block. They drove to a diner in Georgetown and sat across from each other in a corner booth, and the waitress brought coffee and neither of them ordered food, and she didn't push it. They stayed for 3 hours. Nobody asked for autographs or photographs, though 3 people recognized them. The city seemed to understand, at least in that diner, that some reunions are not for anyone else. The things they said in that booth are not things that belong to anyone outside of it. But later, Daniel would describe one moment to Agent Mercer, almost by accident, in the middle of an unrelated conversation, the way the important things tend to surface. He said that at one point Kevin had looked at him across the table and said, "I never forgot your face. I kept it the whole time. I used it when I needed to remember that there was a reason to stay careful." And Daniel had not been able to say anything back for a while, and Kevin had not seemed to need him to. The federal case against Gerard Solis took 11 months to build to indictment. It was the kind of investigation that required coordinating multiple field offices, international financial investigators, the IRS Criminal Division, and eventually cooperation from law enforcement agencies in 3 foreign countries where Ashby Group's holding companies had registered entities. The encrypted files on Kevin's hard drives formed the evidentiary spine, but corroborating documentation had to be assembled from financial records, real estate transactions, and the testimony of 8 individuals who agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Kevin testified before a federal grand jury for 4 days. He was a precise witness. He had the documents memorized and could locate any specific file within his organized archive in under 30 seconds, and he answered questions without embellishment or evasion. The prosecutors who worked with him said privately that he was the clearest witness they had ever put before a grand jury. What he had done for over a decade inside Ashby Group had not been passive survival. It had been deliberate, methodical documentation by someone who understood with absolute clarity that the evidence he was building was the only thing that could eventually give his stolen life back some measure of meaning. Of the 14 children Kevin had identified in Ashby's records, 11 were located alive during the course of the investigation. 7 of them were still living under their constructed identities and had to be approached with extraordinary care by trained federal agents because in some cases their constructed lives were the only lives they consciously remembered. 3 others came forward voluntarily once the case became public. 1 had died of natural causes in 2019. 1 remained unaccounted for. The search for that individual is still ongoing. Frank Sutter, Kevin's former assigned guardian, agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a plea arrangement. He was, as it turned out, not a core member of the organization, but rather a paid contractor who had performed the same role for 3 different children over 15 years, managing their cover identities and ensuring their integration into legitimate professional roles. He was 59 when he was arrested, and he wept during his deposition with what appeared to be genuine remorse, though Kevin declined to comment on whether he found that credible. Gerard Solis was arrested at his home in McLean, Virginia, on a Tuesday morning in October, almost exactly 1 year after Warren Ashby's murder. He was 67 years old, fit, silver-haired, and dressed as if he had been expecting company. He said nothing to the agents who arrested him, and said nothing to anyone else for the first 4 months of his legal proceedings, communicating exclusively through a team of attorneys who attempted 3 separate motions to suppress Kevin's encrypted files on the grounds that they had been obtained through unauthorized access to company systems. All 3 motions were denied. He eventually pled guilty on 29 counts, including kidnapping conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder in connection with the death of Warren Ashby. He received a sentence of 41 years without the possibility of parole. At 67, the mathematics were not in his favor. 6 other individuals, including 2 senior attorneys at a prominent D.C. firm, a federal contractor with ties to 3 separate government agencies, and 1 sitting member of a congressional subcommittee on financial oversight, were indicted as part of the broader conspiracy. The congressman resigned within 48 hours of the indictment becoming public, before his attorneys had finished drafting his initial statement. He was convicted 18 months later. Judge Margaret Calloway formally exonerated Daniel Holt on a bright March morning 8 months after Kevin had walked into her courtroom. The proceeding was brief. She read the exoneration order into the record with the same deliberate precision with which she had prepared to deliver his sentence, and when she finished, she looked up and regarded him over her reading glasses for a moment before she said, quietly and off the official record, "I am very glad this is how this story ends, Mr. Holt." Daniel told his attorney afterward that it was the most meaningful thing anyone in a position of authority had said to him in the last 22 months. The question that the media returned to repeatedly in the months following the case, the question that showed up in the documentaries and the long-form features and the podcast episodes, and the congressional testimony about gaps in the federal missing persons system, was the simplest one. How had no one ever found Kevin Holt? The answer was uncomfortable for a number of institutions. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had a file on Kevin dating to 1994 that had been updated twice and then essentially abandoned. The FBI investigation, which had been genuinely extensive in its first year, had narrowed its working theory over time toward the possibility that Kevin had drowned in the river and been carried downstream, and the investigative resources had been directed accordingly. In the absence of any evidence of foul play, the case had not been worked as an abduction. It had been worked as a drowning. The difference in investigative approach was consequential. The Page County Sheriff at the time, a man named Hank Dooley who was retired, and in his 80s by the time the case broke, gave one interview to a Washington Post reporter in which he said simply that they had looked in the wrong direction for 20 years because it had never occurred to any of them that anyone would have a reason to take a 10-year-old boy from a family camping trip, not for the purposes that turned out to be true. Congressional hearings on the failure of federal missing persons infrastructure followed. New protocols were established, resources were allocated. Whether those changes would prove adequate was, as these things always are, a question for a future that hadn't happened yet. Daniel returned to Charlottesville. He reopened the shop. 2 of his 3 employees had stayed on, maintaining the business with help from a volunteer network that had emerged from an online community that supported his case throughout the trial. He worked on engines 6 days a week and was reportedly very good at it, which had always been true. Kevin Holt, after a period of complete quiet that lasted several months, began working with a non-profit organization in Washington that specialized in supporting adults who had experienced identity-based trafficking, individuals whose sense of self had been deliberately dismantled and reconstructed by others. He was 29 years old. He had a social security number again, his original one. He had a driver's license and a passport. He had an apartment in Capitol Hill that he was renting month to month, with a window that looked out at a stretch of sky he found reliable. He visited Charlottesville 4 times in the first year. Each time he and Daniel drove up into the mountains without any particular destination in mind, and walked trails that had no significance to either of them, accumulating new geography that belonged only to them, to the present, to the specific strange gift of having time left. On the 4th visit, they drove back through Page County on the way home. Daniel hadn't planned it. He took a turn he knew and didn't say anything about it. And Kevin looked out the window as the landscape became familiar in the way that something can be familiar even when you have only experienced it once and were 10 years old and terrified. They drove along the river road for a while. The Shenandoah was moving slowly under late afternoon light, the color of hammered copper, and the trees on the far bank were fully leafed and enormous and completely indifferent to anything that had ever happened in their vicinity. Kevin watched the river and said nothing for several miles. Then he said, "I used to dream about this river. Not nightmares, just the river. Just how it looked when I walked toward it that afternoon before they took me." Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "I know," he said. "I used to dream about it too." They drove on. The river kept moving beside them, the way rivers do, without memory, without judgment, carrying everything it encountered toward some place further along and letting it go. The last federal proceeding in the case of Daniel Holt closed on a Thursday afternoon the following spring. It was an administrative matter, a records correction, the final bureaucratic step in a process that had begun when Kevin walked through those courtroom doors 18 months earlier. It required no appearance from either brother. It generated 2 lines in the federal court's public docket and nothing more. That same evening, Daniel drove to the small cemetery outside Charlottesville, where his parents were buried side by side under a dogwood tree that was just beginning to bloom. He stood between the 2 headstones for a while. He had not visited in 3 years. He had not known for 3 years how to be present in that place without being consumed by a grief that had no clean edges, a grief that was partly for his parents, and partly for Kevin, and partly for himself, and partly for the 20 years during which all 3 of those losses had existed simultaneously and without resolution. He had something to tell them now. He didn't know if that was a thing that meant anything. He had lived long enough to be uncertain about most of the things people feel certain about. But he stood between the 2 headstones, and he said it out loud anyway, quietly, just the essential fact of it, stripped of everything except what it was. "He's alive," Daniel said. "Kevin's alive. I brought him home." The dogwood bloomed above him. The evening was warm and entirely still, the kind of still that settles over everything at the end of a long day when the work is finally finished, when the last task has been completed and put down, when the hands that have been gripping something for longer than they should have can at last, carefully, let go.